Center before? Anyone? Okay, one.
One over there.
Oh, wait. He's staying at my house. I made him come. Um, so the first thing to do, first order of business, we all know, take out that thing, turn it off, so you won't make a rude noise and be embarrassed. Okay, got that? Um, we are, before Bill introduces my old friend David Maraniss, I want to give you a few bits of information. One is the books are for sale over there by East City Books. Um, Also, next month in July, we are going to have a slight change of pace in our programming and welcome the Reverend Luis Leon. And he is the former pastor of St. John's Church at Lafayette Square, the pastor to many presidents in the last 24 years. So that could be interesting. I think it will be interesting. Sign up for that. I would also just mention that our Preservation Endowment Fund, you knew this was coming, right? There's always a little fundraising, is going really well. We're aiming for $3 million and we've got 800,000. So if you brought your check with you, there's a guy named Scott. He's over there and he'd be happy to take it. This is a very important effort to keep this building going in perpetuity. And we urge you all who haven't already to kick in a few bucks. And now I will turn it over to Bill and David.
Megan, thank you. Indeed. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Hill Center. Welcome back to Talk of the Hill. A couple of announcements on my part. I just want, first of all, to reinforce Father Luis Leon, I think, will be a very fun guest next in June 17. Carol and I met him recently. 24 years he was pastor of St. John's, right there, the Church of the Presidents, they call it. So he was there for Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump. We've had we've had nuns and bishops, but never a priest here at the Hill Center. But he's got lots of stories about, as you can imagine, how much advance notice do they get that the president is showing up? Does he have to change his sermon because the president may not like things he plans to say? All those kinds of stories from Luis Leon, who is also a native of Cuba and came here when he was 12 as part of the famous Peter Pan movement at the time. So it's very interesting, June 17. The other thing I want to mention is sort of a big day for me because last Friday was the last day of my daily radio TV show. And starting this week, I'm doing a new podcast. This evening's program will be one of the podcasts, not this week, however. The first podcast pops up tomorrow, and it's called the Bill Press Pod. So you can go, wherever you go to podcast, now if you go the Bill Press Pod, you'll see the new podcast. And our first interview tomorrow is with Congressman Jamie Raskin from Maryland, I interviewed him today, some very interesting things to say about impeachment and the 25th Amendment, and that will be posted tomorrow morning. So that's looking ahead. Tonight, so pleased to welcome a good friend and one of us here in Washington, D.C., associate editor still at the Washington Post, 3 times nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, and one time won the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the Bill Clinton campaign in 1992. Out now with his 12th book, wonderful book, you'll love it, called A Good American Family. So David, let me start there. I mean, you're 12 books, and you look back, they include sports figures, Vince Lombardi, Roberto Clemente, book about the city of Detroit, books about presidents, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, the 1960 Olympics, the Vietnam anti-war protests, big, big, big scale. And on this one, you're focusing on your family, your mother, your father. Was that kind of weird to go from all that big down to your home?
It was different, certainly. I'd spent much of my career as a biographer delving into the lives of people who were strangers to me at the beginning. And after 4 years of research, they became familiar. And here I was dealing with my father and mother who were intimately familiar to me, but I was afraid that using the same methodology I use in all of my books, that they might seem more strangers by the end. That did not happen. But it was, yeah, in so many ways, a different experience, especially psychologically and emotionally dealing with, we all of us here have family stories, family mythology that's passed down from one generation to another. Some of it might be true, some of it not. But we don't have a biographer going back into looking at the reality of what happened, and that's what I did in this case.
What triggered you to write about your dad? What was it that prompted you to tell this story?
The book is about my father being called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1952 after his name was named by an informant in Detroit, and he was fired from his job as a newspaperman, and we bounced around for 5 years while he was blacklisted. My father, by the time I became of a conscious age, had survived that and moved on. I was 2 when this happened. By age 7, after the 5 years of blacklisting, my father started teaching me all of the lessons of his life. Don't fall for any rigid ideology. Search for the truth wherever it takes you. And he had survived and moved on and created a wonderful life for himself, my mother as well, and our family. It was not something he talked about. And it was not something I was going to write about while he was alive. I wanted to honor him in that way, but it was probably a book that was in me all along. And it's, about 8 years ago, I started thinking about it deeply and thinking about, I'm doing all these other biographies, exploring the mythology of Barack Obama, in different ways, and Bill Clinton and Vince Lombardi. And it's time for me to really explore my own life. Why, not just my parents, but also to learn from that why I am the way I am, which happened with the research for this book.
Your dad was a member of the Communist Party.
He was. My parents met at the University of Michigan in the mid 1930s, late 1930s, a period that in many ways was sort of similar to the 1960s in terms of its activism. They were motivated by the idealism of the Great Depression and the challenges of capitalism during that era, by the rise of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. I'm sorry I can't face this part of the crowd, but okay. And by the ever-present racial injustice of the US. Those were the idealistic things that brought them into this. My mother was a member of the Young Communist League at the University of Michigan. Her older brother was also a Michigan student and went off to fight in the Spanish Civil War. One of 3 Michigan students who joined the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in Spain. My father was the editorial editor of the Michigan Daily in the late 1930s and was radicalized during that period. And, when I'm going through the editorials that he wrote, there's times when I shake my head and said, "What were you thinking, Dad?" I mean, and not about funny things, like his support, his rationalization of the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939, which a lot of young communists found a way to support, even though it was indefensible. And then he went off. Well, we'll get to that. He was in World War II, and in '52 he was called before the committee because of his past.
Right. You mentioned some of the factors that drove some Americans to consider joining the Communist Party. Was it ever? And you also mentioned, so you were growing up in Ann Arbor. This happened in Ann Arbor, right?
Yeah, I
Detroit. It's
wasn't born.
Detroit. I'm sorry.
Ann Arbor, no,
Yeah.
well, Michigan is where it started.
Yeah.
Detroit is where he was fired.
Okay.
Yes.
Um,
At the
but
Detroit Times, he worked.
you mentioned that at one point there, around that time, there were 1,332 members of the Communist Party in Michigan, which had a population of 6.4 million. So it does raise the question, was the Communist Party, American Communist Party, ever a real serious threat at all?
I would say no. I would say that there were certainly some members of the Communist Party in the United States who were either agents for the Soviet Union or advancing the Soviet arguments. Um, and some were, like Alger Hiss was in the State Department. I mean, there were other people who were spies for the Soviet Union. A very minute number of that already minute number of total members of the Communist Party USA. It was the whole basis of the attack on the party was that if you were a member of the Communist Party USA, that meant automatically that you supported the violent overthrow of the United States government.
Which your father did not.
Never. No, I mean, absolutely not. He loved the United States and was trying to improve it. He was naive about the Soviet Union, to say the least. But the vast majority of leftists, communists, socialists of that era, people who were either in the party or sympathetic to it in some way, were not in any way espousing the overthrow of the American government.
One thing that I found striking was that at the hearing where your father's called in, the chairman is Chairman John Stevens Wood,
Yes.
who was a member of the KKK, who was a sponsor of the poll tax in the United States Congress. So who was the un-American?
Well, that's
your
the central
father or the chairman of the committee?
Yeah, thank you for asking, because I consider that the central question of the book. Who is American? I mean, it's a question that's as valid today as ever. Who decides who's American? John Stevens Wood, yes, was a Southern racist. Yes, was briefly a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and also was involved in the most notorious lynching in Georgia history, the lynching of Leo Frank, the Jewish industrialist who was accused falsely of murdering a 13-year-old girl in his pencil factory. And that event was like this is a bad analogy, but it's sort of like the OJ trial of its era, in that it was front page news for there was no TV, but the New York Times covered it, the Chicago Tribune, the Anti-Defamation League actually was born because of that case. So much pressure was put on that the governor commuted the death sentence of Leo Frank. And the powers that be in Marietta, Georgia, where the girl was from, were so enraged by this and by their own sort of anti-Northern populist, anti-Semitic fervor that they concocted a plot to go up to the prison where Leo Frank was held, seize him from the prison, put him in the back of a car, drive him back to a field near Marietta, and lynch him. The mastermind of that plot was Marietta's most powerful figure, a judge named Newt Morris. And Newt Morris's chief disciple was John Stevens Wood, the future chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was Wood who drove the car that carried the lynched body of Leo Frank. So this person, this congressman, is the one calling my father, who, as we'll see, commanded an all-black unit in World War II, un-American.
Right. I wanted to get to that because the other thing that struck me was going on at the time was the worst of treatment of African Americans in this country since slavery, I guess. But so there was segregation in the military, obviously still segregation in American schools and businesses, restaurants, that veterans coming home from the war, who had African Americans who had fought in the war coming home and not being able to enjoy the freedoms of this country, that in the military, there were also these battles going on among defense workers, white
Yes.
White workers in the defense factories did not want African Americans coming up from the South and working in these defense plants. I mean, that was a reality that the Communist Party, American Communist of the USA, was able to exploit, right, and take
They did
advantage of.
exploit it. My parents were involved on both ends of that. My mother during the war worked as a Rosie the Riveter in a defense plant in Detroit, which was where riots broke out in 1943 between black and white workers over housing and everything else that was going on, and the tensions of that moment and the racism of Detroit. My mother was a shop steward and was taking a trolley through the area where part of the violence was going on, and she was untouched. And my family's sort of legend is that it was because of her goodness about that issue. But in any case, at the same time, my father was in the military. He enlisted right after Pearl Harbor. He was investigated by military intelligence because of his radical past at Michigan. For a while, he was, as many radicals were, he was put into isolated posts. Some were sent to the Aleutian Islands. He was sent out to West Texas and Oklahoma. And finally, in late 1944, he got his shot, which was he had gone through officer candidate school, and he was put in charge of training and leading an all-black unit at Camp Lee, Virginia. And in researching this book, I was able to get 100 letters that my father wrote to my mother as he was in that process. And they're incredibly illuminating about his understanding of the complexity of a situation where he was training young black men who were being asked to fight and perhaps die in the name of democracy and liberty for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. And in his letters, you see him sort of being proud that he's training this group in a way that the NCOs aren't considered Uncle Toms. They were black, the officers were white. As it turns out, in that segregated racist era, the officers of these all-black units tended to be almost exclusively either Southerners who were considered, would know how to handle blacks because of the dealings in the South and the racism in the South, or Northern radicals. And my father was in the latter group. And he trained and led this black company in a way that they thought they were getting a fair shake.
I had never seen before this poem by Langston Hughes, which you quote in the book, just one stanza. Yet you say we're fighting for democracy. Then why don't democracy include me? I ask this question because I want to know how long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow.
Yeah. That was the reality of that time. I mean, you know, the greatest generation, the good war, all of that can be true, and yet there's this other side to the reality of race in America coexisting with that.
We're at the Hill Center in Washington, D.C., talking with David Maraniss, author of A Good American Family. A Good American Family. And you talk about this, it had many echoes for me because growing up about the same time, you know, having family reunions, having barbecues, loving baseball, going to the beach. I mean, that was your family.
That was all of my family, yes.
And how did being identified as a communist and fired impact your family? I mean, there's a real cost that a lot of families suffered, yours in particular.
The title comes from a quote from one of the members of the committee, Charles E. Potter of Michigan, who was on the House Un-American Activities Committee when my father was called before it. And in a speech, he said he was shocked that anybody from a good American family could be attracted to communism or socialism. I read that and said, well, I come from a good American family. And we were affected by it. As I said, I was only 2, not quite 3 when this happened. We bounced around for 5 years, 3 kids. I had an older brother, Jim, and a sister, Jeannie. Jim was 6 and Jeannie was 5. I was 2. When my father was fired, we moved to his parents' little apartment in Coney Island, Brooklyn. He was working briefly for a newspaper called The Compass before that folded after a month or so. Then we moved back to Ann Arbor, where my mother's parents lived, briefly in their house. Again, three kids and the parents and the grandparents. Then we moved to Cleveland when my father was able to land a job on the Cleveland Plain Dealer because some of his friends from the University of Michigan worked there. And that lasted until the FBI visited the editor of the Plain Dealer and said, "You hired a former communist." He was fired. We went back to Detroit, moved a couple of times in Detroit. My father was blacklisted from the newspaper business. He actually spent some time selling party favors for labor picnics. Anybody who knew my father knows how preposterous that idea was, trying to sell anything. He was a tried and true newspaper man, and that's pretty much what he was. Then a newspaper, or the typographers, the printers of the Davenport and Rock Island papers went on strike, and the ITU, the Typographical Union, formed a labor paper there called Labor's Daily. They hired my father to be the editor, and that was the start of the turning of our lives. It was sort of a ragtag operation, but my father was truly excellent at every part of newspapering, the layout, the headlines. My favorite headline he ever wrote was when Bing Crosby died. The headline was, "Crosby dies at 74, 2 over par." He died on a golf course. Par is 72. The average age for a male in the United States then was 72. So, it was great. Anyway, he knew how to do it. But he put out this little paper, and every other week, the paper would run a column called Hello, Wisconsin, by the old progressive founder and publisher of the Madison Capital Times, William T. Evu, a great friend of Fighting Bob La Follette. And Evu saw this little paper down in Iowa and said, "Who's putting this out? It's better than our paper." It just looked really good and had interesting things in it. They were covering the Montgomery bus boycott when no one else in the North was, and things like that. And so the strike paper folded, and Evu brought my father up to Madison. We got there in the summer of 1957. Joseph McCarthy, the Wisconsin senator whose name is given to that entire era, had just died. The Milwaukee Braves were on their way to winning the World Series. I was turning 8. We lived near the zoo, and our family was saved.
Did you, as part of the research, I didn't see this, but did you ever try to figure out how many people spent from the FBI, how many agents spent how many hours, days, months following your father around? I mean, every single place he went, there was an FBI agent following him for years.
Yes, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for my father's FBI files. I got the first batch after a year and a half, and it was 100 pages or so. And then another batch a year later, another 100 plus pages. And in that you see, I never counted the hours, but you see them basically following almost every day, either an FBI informant or an FBI agent. I think I counted something like 17 agents and 37 informants who were keeping track of my father, who was going to work and going to meetings and talking and writing and never committing any crimes, never doing anything other than being an American and expressing his opinions, which were controversial, certainly, and you might say wrong-headed, but that's what America's all about.
So we read your reaction to all of this in the book, but we also get to hear for the first time your father's reaction in a statement, which you include in the book, that he wanted to give in front of that committee to explain who he was and what he was all about. And the chairman would not let him read it.
Yeah, it was in May of 2015 when The statement had been essentially buried when the chairman wouldn't let my father read it. And in May of 2015, I went to the National Archives and found the boxes of material on the Detroit hearings, and there was a folder that said Elliot Maraniss. And inside the folder was my father's statement. I had known it existed because the transcripts of all congressional hearings are public record. So I'd read him saying, I'd like to give a statement about what I think it means to be an American. And then the chairman would, the Southern racist, saying, no, you can't do that. He would have been allowed to do it if he had confessed to his sins and named names, which he did not do. So, you know, this book came out a few weeks ago, and I've gone around the country, and every place I've gone, I've wanted to read part of the statement to give my father his voice after 67 years. Statement of Elliot Maraniss. I was taught as a child and in school that the highest responsibility of citizenship is to defend the principles of the U.S. Constitution and to do my part in securing for the American people the blessings of peace, economic well-being, and freedom. I have tried to do that to the very best of my ability. And for doing just that and nothing more, I have been summarily discharged from my job. I have been blacklisted in the newspaper business after 12 years in which my competence and objectivity have never once been questioned. I must sell my home, uproot my family, and upset the tranquility and security of my 3 small children in the happy formative years of their childhood. But I would rather have my children miss a meal or two now than have them grow up in the gruesome, fear-ridden future for America projected by members of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. I don't like to talk about these things, but my Americanism has been questioned, and to properly measure a man's Americanism, you must know the whole pattern of a life. The U.S. Constitution and its Bill of Rights are not simply musty documents in a library. They have meaning only if they are used. To betray and subvert the Bill of Rights is the most un-American act any man or committee can do, for that document was brought into being and maintained throughout our history by men who gave their lives in blood. Every newspaperman knows that history is not a printed page. It's the passion and striving, the struggling and endurance of men and women. These qualities that went into the making of our nation can be discarded only at great peril to ourselves and our children. From the time of Peter Zenger, the colonial printer who defied the British Crown's effort to impose censorship in the American colonies, right down to the present, newspapermen have zealously defended freedom of the press. For the First Amendment is not only a guarantee of free speech and a free press, it's also an indispensable part of self-government. That's what makes this committee so dangerous. Ostensibly designed to protect the government against overthrow by force and violence, it proceeds by force, terror, and threats to overthrow the rights of the American people. This committee reflects no credit on American institutions or ideas. Its attempt to enforce conformity of political or economic thought is a long step toward dictatorship that holds the greatest danger to the American people. In this country, we have never acquiesced in the proposition that persons could be punished for their beliefs. Statement of Elliot Maraniss, read by his son 67 years later.
All right. Now you know why the chairman did not want him to read it. The passages, quotes from your father are very powerful. And the one that maybe struck me the most, and I'll close on this and then open up questions for the rest of you. Some of the letters that he wrote to your mother, and this one in particular, where he wrote, I forget where he was now, but at any rate, he's in military service, writing back to his wife, home with a couple of kids, maybe not
Right.
you yet, who says, whatever else I do in my life, you can be sure that I will also write. When I come back to civilian life, I will most likely go back to newspaper work and make that work my base of operations for whatever writing I do. From that, I can branch off into other kinds of writing, but I will always do newspaper work also, for I love it, and it is in my blood. no doubt why you are who you are. The apple did not fall far.
You know, I've all my my adult life, I've said I love writing. It's in my blood. I never knew that my father used the exact same words, and when I read that, it just washed over me. You know, yes, and I'm proud to be my father's son
Yeah.
and my mother's.
And another great writer. Um, I promise that was the last one. Just one more, because I saw a quote of yours today also, which struck me that you said, I look for two things when I'm about to launch into a book. First, there has to be a dramatic arc to the story itself that will carry me and the reader from beginning to end. Second, the story has to weave through larger themes that can illuminate the world of the subject. Um, so I want to ask you, what larger themes do you see coming out of this book today? And are there any parallels today that you see to the age of McCarthyism?
I started this book before Donald Trump rode down the golden escalator. But everything that's happened since has echoes from the past and the period that I wrote about. The use and manipulation of language to for political purposes, the use and manipulation of fear and hysteria for political purposes, and the central question of what does it mean to be an American and who decides and how is that decided? I mean, from the Muslim ban to the activities at the southern border, to the disparagement of a Latino judge, to the use of the language in Orwellian ways. Joseph McCarthy, the sort of the, the person who was most known for that earlier period of the Red Scare, was a demagogue who really didn't have an ideology except for himself, and took advantage of the hysteria of that moment and fed it. And I think we have a president now who's doing that. And the one major difference is that McCarthy was a senator. The members of the UAC, House Un-American Activities Committee, were congressmen. And now we have a president doing the same things.
It's a wonderful book. East City Books is here. The only thing better than hearing about it from David Maraniss is reading the book yourself, and you'll have a chance to buy a copy. David will be happy to hang around and sign copies for you right after this. So, David, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we have two microphones, one on either side. Please raise your hand and also wait for the microphone so we can be sure to get your question as part of the record of the event tonight. Megan, I'll just let you, yeah.
When was it known that the committee chairman had been involved in the Leo Frank? Was it known at the time or retrospective?
It was not known at the time. In 1955, after John Stevens Wood was out of Congress, President Eisenhower nominated him for a position on the Subversive Activities Control Board. And it was at that time that it was revealed that he had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan as a young man. And, you know, the press wasn't great during that period by any stretch, but the Washington Post, the paper that Megan and I worked at, had a great reporter, Murray Martyr, who was covering that. And he wrote about John Stevens Wood's past. But his involvement in the lynching came out only in the last, briefly, in a wonderful book called The Dead Shall Rise, written by Stephen Oney, a friend of mine, who it was about the Leo Frank lynching. And he's the one who sort of uncovers the fact that Judge Newt Morris was the mastermind. And there's one sentence in there about Wood, and I saw that and developed it from there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, you want to start here, and then we'll come over to your side. Yes, yes, ma'am.
Was your father ever exonerated from the problem with the way that it happened with the the black situation, or did he finally get exoneration?
He Madison gave us the exoneration. The government never did. No, they wouldn't apologize for it, and I don't think my father would ask for an apology. It was too deep for that to. But he survived it, and had a very successful life in Madison. Rose to become the editor of the Capital Times, the paper that hired him in 1957. My mother went back to school and was Phi Beta Kappa at the University of Wisconsin, and had a wonderful career as an editor at the University of Wisconsin Press. My older brother and sister were scholars. My sister was one of the first presidential scholars. My brother went to Harvard. I was the dumb kid in the family, but seriously. But in any case, the exoneration came from life, not from any powers, and from the sort of encompassing nature of Madison, Wisconsin, that made some of it possible. And
Yeah. Good for Madison, Wisconsin.
I see a Packer hat back there, by the way.
Oh, yes, right.
So forgive me, I don't know a whole lot about this period in American history. You had said your father was a little naive about the American Communist Party.
Yes.
If he had known what Stalin was doing, would it have mattered? In other words, could you be a good member of the U.S. Communist Party and still be a good American, knowing what was going on in Russia?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think that he had to know some of it, not all of it, but by 1938 there were purges going on that Stalin was, purging the many of the leaders and executing them, and that was reported even in the Michigan Daily, the student paper that my father edited. So I raised that question there. What was he thinking at that point? I don't know. But there were rationalizations for everything, I would say, all the way up through the time of Khrushchev. And almost, so there were points along the way where you can say, what were you thinking? Then you get to 1956 and the Hungarian Revolution being quashed. And that's really the final. I mean, my parents had already left the party years before that, but I think that was kind of the final one. There was even harder to accept what was going on. But people see what they want to see. It's human nature. And it takes something very dramatic to break people out of their mindsets. A lot of people never learn and grow and just become more so. And I was lucky that my parents did learn and grow.
Question here? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Where were we? Yes.
What would you say the long-term impact of the House Un-American Activities Committee would be from a historical viewpoint?
Well, it began in the late 30s and actually existed all the way to 1975.
Really?
But yes.
Whoa.
But its major work was done between 1947, when the Hollywood 10 were called before the committee, and they took the First Amendment rights, and that doesn't work. So they were cited for contempt of Congress and imprisoned, all 10 of them, including Dalton Trumbo and Ring Lardner Jr., who actually ended up in the same penitentiary in Connecticut as the chairman of the committee, who was an embezzler at his congressional office, Thomas from New Jersey. Then it called Pete Seeger before the committee and challenged his Americanism, and Paul Robeson and
Arthur Miller.
Arthur Miller, who's in my book because my father went to the same high school as Arthur Miller, Abraham Lincoln High in Brooklyn, and then followed Miller to the University of Michigan. And Miller was best friends with one of the 3 Michigan students, including my uncle, who went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Miller was convicted of contempt of Congress, but it was overturned and he never served. And the chairman of the committee at one point, when Miller was being called, literally called Joseph Rao the night before, who was Miller's lawyer, and said, the committee chairman says if you get Marilyn Monroe's autograph, we won't call. Miller was about to marry Marilyn
About to
Monroe.
marry her, right? Yeah.
So I would say that the overall impact, to get back to your final question, is that it eroded civil liberties in America, and civil liberties are at the heart of the American democracy.
Can I mention one other character that, or
Yeah.
person in the book, I guess, that I think deserves some credit, is Coleman Young.
Oh, thanks for bringing that up. Yes. Coleman Young was a labor organizer in Detroit. He too was called before the committee the same week as my father. They had the same lawyer who actually went on to become a congressman as well, George Crockett of Detroit. And Coleman Young turned that committee on end because both John Stevens Wood from Georgia and the committee counsel, Frank Tavener of the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, who came out of the Byrd machine, which Megan knows all too well, having covered Virginia, the segregationist Byrd machine. They both spoke with Southern accents, and whether consciously or subconsciously, they pronounced the word nigra in a way that sounded like something else. And Coleman Young went nuts and said, "That's not how you pronounce that word." And he put them on the defensive from that point on. And at one point they were questioning his patriotism, and he said, "Explain to me the patriotism of when I, as an officer in the Army Air Corps in World War II, go into an officer club and they don't let me in because of the color of my skin." He just had them from the beginning, and they didn't know what to do with Coleman Young. And he said afterwards, in an interview with the great oral historian Studs Terkel, he said, "After that hearing, I felt like Joe Louis coming home from a fight." Joe Louis, who was another Detroiter. He said, "Wherever I went in Black Bottom or Paradise Valley in Detroit, into the barber shops or on the streets, people would come up to me and pat me on the back and say, 'Somebody finally stood up to those Southern racists.'" 52, that happened. That was the start of Coleman Young's career, which took him to the mayor's office.
Please.
I
Yes.
think I heard you say that you waited until your father passed before starting this book.
Yes.
Could your father have written this book?
He wouldn't write this book. He, considering that he taught me almost all the skills that I developed as a writer, he physically could have done it. But, he didn't want to talk about it. It was a shadow of our family's life. He had survived it, he'd moved on, and he didn't want to be defined by that. So there was one point late in his life when he started to write a memoir, but it was really about my mother, sort of portraying her as the hero of the story, which is very true, but it wasn't this story. He never, in it, he sent me a copy of it. He doesn't even mention, he doesn't mention the UAC hearings. There was one sentence where he said that he was blacklisted, but then he crossed that out. So he was not going to write this book. And it was important for me to figure out why I wanted to write it, and it wasn't to embarrass my father in any way, but to illuminate that period and show that my father, whatever I would find, what my father's role was and how it affected our family.
What would your father say about the state of journalism in Trump America today?
Well, first of all, he never liked the word journalist. He just didn't like it. He said, "I'm a reporter. I'm not a journalist." And I always liked that. And he was also just a newspaper guy, and journalism or the media today is so amorphous that it's really almost impossible to define. What is journalism? What isn't? I know that he was a maverick. He was always trying to take on the powers that be and question them. And but he was also considered very open-minded. The first person who called me and my mother when my father died was Tommy Thompson, the Republican governor of Wisconsin, who knew my father as an open-minded and fair-minded newspaper guy. I think he would, you know, he'd be depressed. Not, he never got depressed. He was an optimistic person. He would be enraged by the Fox News, Trump, Breitbart, Orwellian nature of all of that right now, and push the press to do their work, which I think, you know, so, you know, some places like the Washington Post are doing, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. A great team there at the Washington Post and the New York Times, I'd add.
Yes,
too, right?
oh,
Some of the-
absolutely. I agree.
Some of the best journalism I think we've seen since the days of Watergate.
I-
Yes, ma'am.
my
We'll make
question
this the
is-
last question,
Okay.
please.
It was sort of along those lines. I was going to ask if you see any parallels between the HUAC period and today, where there's sort of a breakdown of civility and the name calling, unfortunately, by the chief executive of, you know, calling the mayor of London a stone cold liar on his way to London. So do you see any parallels?
Well, what I
A
see
stone
is,
cold loser, he said. A stone cold loser.
yeah,
That
I
was
mean,
before
yeah,
Air Force One had landed in England. Yes.
yes, there are parallels, and but there are more parallels to Orwell than to anything else, really. I mean, we're living through what Orwell predicted we would be, and I think it's the, you know, I mean, American history has gone through a lot of really difficult periods. This is another one. It's not the worst, but it's the most odd and discombobulating one we've dealt with, because we've never had a president like this before. We've had presidents that you can disagree with strenuously about their policies, but not one where you know, I don't even have to say anymore. So, you know, I would say that my father was an optimist. He inculcated that in me, and my optimism has been challenged like never before.
Yeah. And with that, thank you to David Maraniss, and thank you for all coming. There it is. A Good American Family. I read it in 2 days. You will love it. All right.
And I'm not
Thanks
a
so
good
much for
I'm
coming.
not a good salesman, but Howard Stern is the #1 book, so let's
Let's go
read
get
some
it.
real books.